Thanks very much for coming, and your handout is going to come much later in the speech of Dr. King. I will use as an example of the good kind of patriotism. But this is a very University of Chicago talk, really, because it's a case where I've changed my mind over the years as a result of arguments that I've gotten from other people. And I think that's one of the things that's characteristic of our culture, that we listen to each other and people bring counter arguments, and it really does change people. And I like to put that forward because I think there's sometimes a view that people just rather mechanically express their political preferences. I don't even think the judges do that, actually, but certainly we don't do that on the faculty here. And so I published a number of years ago an article called For Love of Country. It's actually widely anthologized, so every time I give permission to have it reprinted, I have to say, please have a little footnote saying I've changed my mind, which was all about why we shouldn't cultivate patriotism and we should cultivate an attachment to all of humanity. And now, in subtle ways, not diametrically 180 degrees, I really have changed my mind. So this is the record of that change and about how patriotism of a certain kind can actually be extremely important for a decent society. So to begin with the problem, in 1892, a World's Fair called the Columbian Exposition was scheduled to take place here in Chicago. You may have read a lot about it. Clearly, it was going to be a celebration of unfettered greed and materialism. Industry and innovation were going to be the central things, and America planned to welcome the world by showing what wonderful products America could produce. The architectural design reflected that emphasis. There were these buildings that were known as the White City. Very little of it actually survives, in fact, almost nothing, which were just a sign of elite privilege, and the poor and the dispossessed were totally kept at bay. If you've ever read the book The Devil in the White City, it's an extremely accurate fictional reconstruction of that. Everything funny, chaotic, noisy was relegated to the Midway, which was outside the precincts of the exposition, but that's where the Ferris wheel was, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and in short, real people disturbing in their heterogeneity. But in the exhibit, instead of real human bodies, the exhibit put forward the gilded statue of the Republic, which was a 65-foot tall gilded statue of a woman holding a scepter and orb. If you've seen the one at Hayes and Cornell, that's 24 feet tall, so the original one was just much larger, but the same shape. And now the Chicago Tribune wrote, "It impresses by its grand presence, its serene and noble face, and its perfect harmony with its magnificent surroundings." Well, advocates for the poor were getting upset about this because they thought that America should stand for something better and something different. And so they went to Benjamin Harrison, who was then president, and it was a group of Christian socialists, in fact, and they said, look, at the exposition, couldn't we have some ritual that would celebrate a sense of equal opportunity and some better values that the nation stands for? And so they wrote a form of words. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And they asked Benjamin Harrison to recite it at the exposition in order to shift the accent away from profit-making. Well, as so often happens with patriotic sentiment, the pledge soon proved a formula of both inclusion and exclusion. Francis Bellamy, who wrote the original words, he was himself a socialist, but he was also a racist. And he wrote all kinds of things saying that new immigrants from Southern Europe were corrupting American values. And meanwhile, he kept promoting the pledge as a litmus test for the real American, the good American, and anyone who wouldn't, as it were, pass that test faced both exclusion and violence. So kids in schools who refused to say the pledge, and I'll come back to that later, were treated extremely badly. So patriotism is two-faced. It faces outward, calling people to care for others and to devote themselves to the common good, but it also, at times and often at the same time, focuses inward, whipping up xenophobia and warlike attitudes toward foreigners and so on. And so the story of the pledge shows us quite a few different things that can go wrong when a nation sets out to inspire strong emotions and ties that to an idea of the nation. First of all, there is the danger that the wrong values will be, the bad values will be whipped up. Exclusionary values that define the nation as all about middle-class white people and whip up suspicion against immigrants. There's also, very much in that story, the danger of coerced conscience. So children were forced into this ritual, they were made to recite the pledge, no matter whether their religions allowed them to do that or not, and we'll talk about that later. And finally, both the exposition itself, with its homogeneity, and then the later ritual of the pledge, shows the danger that patriotism will short-circuit the critical faculties and undercut public debate and social rationality. Well, with these problems in mind, a lot of people, and my former self, used to say, well, why should we have that then? Why should we have all this messy emotion? Instead, what we really need to do is foster a vigorous critical culture capable of debating and thinking well about the nation's problems. Now, the focus on critical culture is certainly not wrong, and I'm going to definitely be approving of that. But by ignoring patriotic emotion, I think such people may have lost sight of an insight that was grasped earlier in the 19th century, namely that patriotic emotion can actually be a necessary motivating force to get people out of their narrow framework of greed and self-interest and to get them to devote themselves to a common cause. Italian revolutionary and nationalist Giuseppe Mazzini, and he was really the one who changed my mind more than anyone else, 19th century thinker, seeing the many ways in which the rise of capitalism threatened the project of equality and the common good, said we can't get people to devote themselves directly to all humanity, but what we can do is to put forward an idea of the nation with the right content, having equality and the common good as part of the content, and then we can use that as a lever to leverage people out of their narrow self-interest. And so basically, I'm going to argue now that Mazzini was right, that national sentiment of a certain kind can play a valuable and even an essential role in creating a decent society in which, indeed, liberty and justice are available to all. And so now let's see how that argument goes. First of all, we keep the dangers in mind, these three on the one side, and then on the other side is what I call the problem of watery motivation. So I see the problem as rather like Odysseus when he had to negotiate his ship's path between Scylla and Charybdis. That is, Scylla was this many-headed monster. So here are the three heads of the monster. And he had to avoid the many-headed monster on the one side, and then on the other side was this deep whirlpool that drew people in and sunk them and drowned them, and that was Charybdis. And so really, the problem of getting patriotism balanced right is like that. It's negotiating between the many-headed monster and then this eclipse of motivation, just people getting sunk and having no courage to go forward. Well, okay, so first of all, we have to say something about what patriotism is. And what I am going to understand it as is a strong emotion that takes the nation as its object. As I will understand it here, it's a form of love. And so it's distinct from simple approval or commitment or embrace of principles. And so as a form of love, it's closely connected to the feeling that the nation is one's own in some way. And of course, rituals of patriotism always harp on that. My country, 'tis of thee, the French national anthem, Allons enfants de la patrie, children of the fatherland, and so on. Now, this love, of course, can be different for different people, and often is. It can be modeled on quite a few different forms of personal love. For some people, the thought is really that the nation is a beloved parent, a mother or a father, And that idea is certainly very prominent in symbolic appeals to patriotism. At another time, the nation is seen as more like a beloved child whose growth and development one needs to promote. At other times, the nation is seen in a more romantic light, as an erotic object of longing in some way. I think the French national anthem is actually very interesting for the way in which, in the first verse, the people are imagined as children of the motherland or the fatherland. And then, in the last stanza, it's actually much more erotic. Liberté chérie, the beloved liberty, is addressed in tones of hushed awe, as though that's a beloved. Well, so as you can see, there's often, even in one and the same person, one and the same anthem, several different kinds of love that are being constructed. But in all forms, patriotism is not universal, it's particularistic. It's personal. It's the my own in some form. So why do we need an emotion like that? It seems like that feature of patriotism makes it ripe for capture by darker forces in people's personalities. Mazzini's answer was that because we're so narrowly focused on personal greed, personal acquisition, we need some strong emotion to jolt us out of that. And he thought we couldn't get that by a purely calm, principle-based sentiment with an abstract object like humanity or the common good. But with the idea of the nation, it was different, because that could be given flesh. We could connect it to geographical features, real history, things that move people in a deeper way. And I think that psychology by now has shown that Mazzini is correct. First of all, we have an evolutionary heritage, which we share with other animals, and we can see in studying the other animals that the sentiments are very narrow in their nature. And if they extend at all, it's only to others who are seen as, in some sense, one's own. Furthermore, even with humans, there are a lot of experiments done by the great psychologist Dan Batson about compassion and its extension, which shows that a particularistic narrative is always crucial if you're going to get people to be strongly committed to helping another person. It's a vividly told story in which the person is presented as a particular with a particular history. So the conclusion is, I think, that if altruistic emotion is to have real motivational power, it needs to hitch itself to the concrete. The idea of the nation then needs to hook us to the concrete through several different kinds of things. For example, named individuals, specific episodes in history, and very often physical features of a landscape. And then, I think above all, narratives of struggle involving suffering and hope. And we seek devotion and allegiance to the nation through that. Now that brings me to one of the greatest essays about the idea of the nation by a French political theorist named Ernst Renan, R-E-N-A-N, at the end of the 19th century. It's called What is a Nation? And it's still the first thing that you'll get in anthologies on this topic because it was just so good. What Renan said is, look, the nation is it's not obvious what a nation is. It isn't just geography. That isn't what makes people held together. And it isn't just a certain kind of ethnicity either. Well, what he argues is that the nation is a story. And what it is that holds people together is a certain story of struggles that they faced in the past and hopes for the future. What it is that we have perhaps died for, what we're willing to live on together for. So he calls it a spiritual principle. And the spiritual principle involves a story of the past, usually of adversity and suffering, and then a picture of the future, a commitment, a willingness to go on and face struggle for the sake of a very beautiful future. So, Renan concludes, one loves in proportion to the sacrifices to which one has consented and in proportion to the ills that one has suffered. And if we follow the psychologist, we'll want those sacrifices to be presented not just abstractly, but in concrete terms to inspire real particularistic love. Okay, before we get to the good examples, let's look at the counterarguments. So the dangers, and do we think that they're such that we should avoid patriotism with all its possibilities? Well, the first and most obvious one is the danger of misplaced values. Talk about patriotism and people immediately think of Nazi Germany and its rallies that whipped up emotion against Jews and other people. And so, of course, patriotism has often done that. And it's also whipped up emotion against foreigners and so on. So if we are going to whip up strong passions, we want to make sure that we don't whip them up for the wrong thing. But what's the objection? I mean, the objection seems to be that we better do without it. And so it's very difficult to know, I think, what the content of this objection really is. Does the objector think that then there's any inherent tendency in patriotic love that leads only to the bad rather than to the good? If so, then we need to hear why that's so. But usually people just cast aspersion on patriotism and they don't really say why that's so. Since it's a form of love, unless we think that there's any reason to think that love in general is always unwise, it seems somewhat implausible that patriotic love would always be unwise. Well, maybe instead the objection is to the idea of the nation as an object of love. Some people, of course, believe that the very idea of the nation is a primitive idea to be supplanted in a future by the whole world of humanity. Well, of course, even such people like Mazzini might think that the nation plays a crucial intermediary role, but I would go further and say that, that the nation is the largest unit we know that's decently accountable to people and that decently realizes their aspirations and their voices. And so it seems implausible to think that the nation itself is inherently a bad object of attachment. The most likely thing that people think, I think, is the following. Emotions are always pretty dangerous and risky. Look at all the trouble they've caused in this case and in that. We could do without them as we pursue our good values, so let's just do that. Now, I think, put that way, that's a very risky strategy, because what we can, if we think back to cases where there were some bad emotions around, if there are no good emotions on the other side, that's a pretty bad situation. You think about World War II, and you think about Winston Churchill's injunction to blood, toil, tears, and sweat. That was a highly emotive speech. But without that kind of whipping up of passions, very unlikely that the dangers of Nazism would have been averted. Well, so the objector is just assuming that somehow good goals power themselves into being and can defeat the bad without any emotional motivations at their back. And I think history just proves that picture wrong. When the good fall silent emotionally, then the bad are all too likely to prevail. So I think the best response to that group of objections is we better cultivate as well a vigorous critical culture, and we better be very sure that the values we're encouraging people to attach themselves to are not the bad values. But that doesn't mean leaving out all patriotic emotion. One way of averting the danger is to focus on what narrative we use of the nation. And that's, I'm going to get to that with King later. Since if the nation is a kind of story, then we have a lot of materials around in the past, and we can select which materials we put forward as the story of what the nation is all about. We can do this in a racist and exclusionary way, or we can do it in an aspirational and inclusive way. And so I think that, again, is part of an answer to that objection. The second objection, coerced conscience, has deep historical roots, and certainly in our own country, and yet I think it's actually the relatively easiest to answer. At one time in our history, the urgent importance of patriotism was simply understood to justify coercion of children against their conscience. So states simply required the Pledge of Allegiance, and children who refused to recite it on conscientious grounds were usually expelled from school, and then, in a more wonderful catch-22, their parents were fined or jailed for contributing to the delinquency of a minor because their children were not in school. For a while, that didn't even get tested in the courts because a lot of these groups were pacifists and they didn't want to litigate. But the Jehovah's Witnesses, who have played a really wonderful role in our legal history because they are willing to litigate and yet they have very heterodox beliefs, they challenged this. And so we got the case Minersville versus Gabaitis, which a lot of you will have studied. Now, the Gabaitis children were Jehovah's Witness children, and they testified very eloquently that their religion taught them that the pledge was idolatrous and that they were good patriots, they loved their country, but they couldn't go through that ritual because it was a form of idolatry. The school board wasn't convinced, so eventually they litigated and went all the way up to the Supreme Court, where they met with Justice Frankfurter. Justice Frankfurter expressed personal sympathy with the children. He said that as a Jew, he couldn't but sympathize with the religious minority, but nonetheless, he was persuaded, not only had a strong opinion of his own, but clearly he persuaded a majority of the court to go along with him. He was a very zealous patriot. This was 1939. There was a real need for patriotism to hold us together in the face of the threat of the Axis powers. And Frankfurter just thought that comes first. So he grants that the First Amendment entails that restriction on conduct expressive of religious conviction can be justified only by, quote, specific powers of government deemed by the legislature essential to secure and maintain that orderly, tranquil, and free society without which religious toleration itself is unattainable. He then argues that national unity and national cohesion supply the state with, quote, an interest inferior to none in the hierarchy of values. The school board's view that requiring the pledge is crucial to promote that central interest is plausible, he said, since the flag is, quote, the symbol of our national unity, transcending all internal differences, however large. Now, however, he doesn't really address the issue in the case, namely, is it plausible to hold that national unity and cohesion require enforcing the pledge against a small number of children with sincere religious objections? He focuses on the general issue of national unity, the general justification for having the pledge in schools, rather than on the conscientious acts of two highly patriotic and respectful teenagers who certainly were not going to be imitated by their peers. In fact, Lillian Gabaitis, who's still living, has recently given an interview where she talks about mud being thrown at their house and even stones by the school bus as it went by the house. So Justice Stone, in his stinging dissent, said, quote, I cannot say that the inconveniences which may attend some sensible adjustment of school discipline in order that the religious convictions of these children may be spared presents a problem so momentous or pressing as to outweigh the freedom from compulsory violation of religious faith which has been thought worthy of constitutional protection. Well, I think basically the answer to this objection was that Stone was right and Frankfurter was wrong, and the nation soon agreed with that when, after Minersville, there was a lot of violence against Jehovah's Witnesses and people saw that this was actually a very bad state of affairs. So the court soon took another case so that they could overrule Minersville. And in West Virginia versus Barnett in 1943, the court, over Frankfurter's very strong dissent, found in favor of the witness plaintiffs, who were a different group in that case. Justice Jackson wrote the majority decision, the majority opinion, and it's become one of the landmarks of American legal life. He treated the case as a compelled speech case rather than a freedom of religion case. But this is what he says. If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. If there are any circumstances which permit an exception, they do not now occur to us. And then he adds that compulsory unity is not even effective. Those who begin coercive elimination of dissent soon find themselves exterminating dissenters. Compulsory unification of opinion achieves only the unanimity of the graveyard. Well, I think Barnett gives the right answer to the second objection. Patriotism and respectful dissent are not incompatible, and indeed our particular tradition emphasizes the freedom of dissent, whether it's religious conscience or freedom of speech, as a part of what this nation stands for. So you can kind of answer it from within. That patriotism of the right sort would not only not allow coerced conscience, but would take pride in the fact that that's not what our nation stands for, as Justice Jackson did. Now then, though, when we think about the more general classroom issue of peer pressure, which of course remains, then we get to this third objection, that even if dissenters are legally protected, isn't there going to be, in any kind of patriotic ritual, the danger of uncritical homogeneity, a culture that lacks decent space for individual expression and dissent? No, of course that's not a problem that's peculiar to patriotism. It's clear that the culture of schools in general is prone to peer pressure, and human beings more generally are prone to peer pressure. Solomon Asch, in his famous experiments, showed that adult subjects were willing to say things that their own eyes showed them to be false, like, is line A longer than line B, when 6 people who came before had said the wrong thing. If there had to be at least 6, but if there were at least 6, then the experimental subject said the wrong thing. So we know that people defer to peer pressure. We also know from Stanley Milgram's experiments that they have an alarming tendency to defer to authority. Milgram showed that experimental subjects are willing to give a very painful, what they thought was a painful and dangerous level of electric shock to an experimental subject who was even screaming and writhing in pain, which of course was faked for the sake of the experiment, so long as the scientist said, you must go ahead. So how can we avert the dangers of uncritical homogeneity? I think, again, Justice Jackson gives us the right path. That is, we ought to, as patriots, as people encouraging patriotism, we ought to insist that the truly patriotic attitude is the one that cultivates a culture of dissent and celebrates freedoms of speech and conscience. His stirring rhetoric is one example of a public speech that's very moving, and it can move people while steering them in the direction of a culture of dissent. And so we can find lots of different ways of doing this. There are, of course, many, by now, ritual texts of dissent in American life that are taught in schools and that should continue to be, from To Kill a Mockingbird to 12 Angry Men, and so, where the hero is the one who sees through the homogeneity of the surrounding culture, who has good critical values, and who pursues the right thing. I should add that in the book I'm writing on this topic, I talk about India too, and Gandhi was one of the great masters of this kind of thing, using emotion to celebrate dissent. He had a favorite song, which was written by the great poet Rabindranath Tagore, and the song was called Walk Alone, and it was all about how even though no one goes along with you, you should pursue your own path, and it ends, if a lamp no one shows, oh you unlucky soul, then in the darkness, striking your own ribs, burn on alone. So it's the song that celebrates passionate dissent, and it's a happy song. If you heard the music, you would think you're hearing a very happy march, and indeed, on the Great Salt March, Gandhi and his 1 million followers sang that song. So it's a funny combination of solidarity and dissent, but there it is, and people were happy to be creating a nation in which dissent would be possible, as of course it was not under the British. So patriotism of the right sort can answer, I think, these 3 objections, but why get into this whole problem? Why not just do away with it because it's so messy? Well, there we get to the other side. That phrase, watery motivation, was said by Aristotle in talking about Plato's ideal city, where people didn't know who their own families were, And he said there are two things above all that make people love and care for something: the thought that it's all yours and the thought that it's the only one you have. And he said in the absence of that, people won't care for anything. They'll have a merely watery motivation. And I think that's basically correct, and that's the reason that we've got to take on patriotism despite the dangers. So then the next task is to turn to history and find examples where it's done well, examples where it's done badly. And in my book, I look a lot at Lincoln and his speeches, and I think he's one of the great crafty masters of retelling a narrative of the nation so that good values rather than racist and exclusionary values are at the core. But since there's no time to go through all the examples, and of course I have Gandhi and Nehru on the Indian side, I want to look now at your handout and at the King's great I Have a Dream speech. And let's remember Renan and what he said, that a nation is not just an entity, a thing whose identity is given in advance. It's a spiritual principle that's constructed out of many possible paths. So what King is doing, like Lincoln, is not so much alluding to a pre-existing national identity as he is reconstructing it or constructing it out of the materials that history offers. Some things are going to be played up, other things are going to be played down, and so let's now see how he did this. Of course, you don't have the text of the whole speech, but I think I chose that speech partly because it's a defining ritual of patriotism in America now, and it has constructed patriotic sentiments for everyone in some way, and there's no doubt that it does it because of the emotions it inspires. If King had not been a great master rhetorician, a great writer, then the whole course of history would be quite different, I think. And so one can construct these emotions through many different media, through public monuments, public celebrations of various kinds, anthems, but I'm just going to focus on this one speech to give a sense of how it can be done and how the rhetoric of it is very important to inspire people beyond the abstract sentiments that it does, of course, contain. So if you look at it now, it begins, as you can see, with an allusion to the Gettysburg Address. 77 years ago was the beginning of that one. And so it positions itself as the next chapter after the Gettysburg Address, but of course also the Emancipation Proclamation, as he says. So just as Lincoln, at the beginning of the Gettysburg Address, looked back on the founding as a moment of commitment to ideals which he specifies and he now sees as gravely threatened, so Lincoln looks back to Lincoln, King looks back to Lincoln as someone who made a commitment, and yet its promise is still unrealized. And now he uses, very cleverly, I think, a mundane and extremely American image for that failure. That is, the nation has given the Negro people a bad check that has come back marked insufficient funds. So this insistent appeal to fiscal rectitude is really a way of alluding also to something deep in American patriotism, since Americans really love to think of themselves as characterized by that virtue, and I think that's very much a part of the political debate today. Throughout the speech, he keeps sounding a note of urgency. He refers to the sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent, of course a reference to Richard III, and therefore one that's quite ominous in the sense that violence may soon be in the offering. And what he really means to say is there will be no peace in America until justice is done. But he also, at the same time, cultivates a patriotism that is restrained and highly critical of violence. As a follower of Gandhi, he emphasizes that his followers have to attain moral superiority by foregoing violent deeds. And like Gandhi, he makes nonviolence seem high, majestic, and violence looks sordid. And like Lincoln, he also appeals to trust between the races, reminding his followers that many white people are present and have joined the struggle for justice. So we cannot walk alone. By cultivating a certain path between anger and hope, which is kind of, there's an emotional map you could draw of this speech. So anger is not going to go toward violence, it's going to go toward hope through the bridge of trust. He diffuses the urge to violence. But now the visionary I Have a Dream section, which I didn't put on the handout because it's so well known, it's central to the Renan-type movement from past to future. Because we have to not only have a past of struggle, but now a future that's beautiful and compelling, for which we'd be willing to go through some struggle. And of course, this is an image of a future nation in which all may join on terms of equality. And it's highly emotive, of course, partly through the poetic and biblical language that King invokes. But then, immediately following on this vision of the new America, he returns to national memory and national tradition, reminding us we're still talking about America here. And he then, as you see in the handout, quotes in full the very familiar song, America, or My Country 'Tis of Thee. My country 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing, land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside let freedom ring. But very significantly, he now says, and if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. So it's kind of past, but it's also kind of future, because these things that we say as if they already exist don't really exist. The song we usually sing kind of bored and complacent as an account of something very familiar is actually the account of a future that's prophetic, that goes with the I Have a Dream section. And its words of freedom must be made true by committed action for justice. So even the complacent song is turned into an exercise of the critical faculties. So he's cultivating a patriotism that's highly selective and highly critical of past homogeneity. Now the next section, which I quoted for you in full, I think the best way of describing it is in the language of jazz as a series of riffs on the song, as freedom is asked to ring from a series of regions of America. So let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and every molehill of Mississippi. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. Now, what's going on here? I think several very interesting things. First, the image of America is now being made concrete and physical by being linked to well-known and beloved features of geography. So it's a kind of my own that people can relate to. Second, geography at the same time is being moralized. So the mountains of New York are not just mountains, they're all now sites of freedom. And third, the body of the nation is being personified in quite a sensuous, even in a subdued way, a sexy way. The heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, the curvaceous slopes of California. So there's something, the cultivation of not just a parental or filial love, but a kind of erotic love. And that's, of course, what powers a lot of patriotism. But also, the end of the Civil War is finally at hand, because now we have a division between the North and the South, but it's overcome, because now freedom is asked to ring from all these sites in the South. And in a manner reminiscent of the Lincoln's second inaugural, King basically expresses malice toward none and charity toward all. There is a note of sly humor as he gets in his dig at Mississippi, every molehill in Mississippi. But I think that's a reminder that bad behavior has not been forgotten. It's just been sort of swept up into a call for freedom, a surge of joy whose object is the nation of the future. And of course, then the passionate conclusion, and when this happens, when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, so now there's no more north-south division, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. And so notice that this is now a movement, which you also see in Lincoln, out from a narrow devotion to America toward all of humanity, because it's all God's children, not just Americans. And that's a very common thing in examples of the good form of patriotism, that you have a reminder at the end that it's not just about your country, but really it's about other countries as well. At the end of Nehru's great Tryst with Destiny speech, he says, these dreams are for India, but they are also for the world, for all the nations and peoples are too closely knit together today for any one of them to believe that it can live apart. So I think that patriotism of the good kind, connected to justice, inclusion, and the pursuit of a common good, can be cosmopolitan. And this is what Mazzini meant by saying we can leverage people through patriotism toward a dedication to humanity. Well, okay, so that's an example of how it can not only can be well done, but was well done in a way that changed history. And of course, the voice was part of it, and so the whole emotive power of the occasion really changed history. But if we're going to teach patriotism in the schools, we still have to think how to do it in ways that avoid these dangers as much as possible. So I want to conclude with some suggestions for what one needs to do if one is going to teach patriotism in the schools. And of course, this speech is part of what gets taught. First thing I would say is begin with love. Children will not be good dissenters in or critics of a nation unless they first love something, unless they first care about the nation as their own. So I think one has to tap into that before one can teach anything. I remember my own first exposure to patriotism was in a story of a woman named Sybil Luddington, but she was a 16-year-old girl who rode a ride that was longer than Paul Revere's ride through the hills of Connecticut to warn that the British were coming. And there was a child's story, a book about that called Ride for Freedom, which I read, and I made my parents act it out and take parts in it so that I could play Sybil, because I always like to cast myself in roles, as you see. But I loved that girl, and I loved the adventure and the heroism and the whole thing. And that was what got me interested in American history and made me want to pursue it further. So I think in general you have to begin with getting people to love something. But then, second, introduce critical thinking early and keep on teaching it. There's a lot of research done by now about how you can teach critical thinking even to very young children, and it can be made fun. It can be a game. And so I think if it's presented in an age-appropriate way, critical thinking can be taught in elementary school, and the dangers begin to be headed off right here. At first, it can be taught without any specific content, but at some point, and maybe later in elementary school and going on into middle school, it can start to take the patriotic narrative itself as its object, getting children to think hard about what really happened in the historical material that they're studying. Why did the patriots fight? What were the reasons that would make something worth fighting for? What about the Civil War? What was it about? And so it's natural to mingle the critical thinking and the love. And so when children visit the Lincoln Memorial, of course, they're going to be powerfully moved by that form, so exhausted and so weighed down by the burden of the war. And they should be encouraged to be moved. But then, of course, that's an occasion for discussion. What was that war about? Again, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, on which I have a section in another chapter of my book. I think that's a miracle because it really has the criticism in the art because of the reflecting surface of the stone, so that while you're mourning and you're experiencing powerful emotions about the fallen, you're also seeing your own face reflected, and that immediately inspires some thought. Where were you? What did you think? What were you doing? And was this war one that should have justified the deaths of so many? So the critical and the emotional can be and often are united. Then third, I would say cultivate positional imagining in a way that includes. one of the worst problems in any elementary school classroom or high school classroom is that people are insensitive to minority groups of various kinds, religious, sexual, and disability groups, and so on. So constantly, what a good teacher will do is to encourage people to take up in their imagination the position of those excluded people, whether by reading stories and narratives of them, putting on plays. Plays of the civil rights movement are a staple now of American elementary education, where one kid plays Rosa Parks and feels with her body what it's like to be sent to the back of the bus. So that kind of use of the imagination, preferably with the arts involved, would be very, very important if the bad values objection is to be headed off. And then fourth, show the reasons for past wars without demonizing. Now, of course, since the beginning of the modern nation, one of the main things patriotic sentiment has done is to inspire war. And one of the main reservations has therefore been that it leads people into rushing into conflict that doesn't have good reasons behind it, and into demonizing foreigners. And already in 1792, the German philosopher Herder said that was a huge danger with modern national sentiment, and he proposed to construct what he called a purified patriotism that would teach a horror of false statecraft that would whip up sentiments towards wars of expansion and wars that were not appropriate. Now, of course, this is a very delicate matter because patriotic sentiment is necessary to get people to endure the hardships of war. And we see that, I think, in the Second World War. And a movie like The King's Speech reminds us that the way rhetoric functioned was absolutely crucial in getting people to be willing to endure serious hardship. So we don't want to suggest that it's always wrong to encourage people to go to war. And so I think Gandhi is not a good guide at this point. Gandhi actually thought that you should reject the invitation to go to war even against the Axis powers. He said that if India were to be invaded, the Indians should not fight, and he said the best way to confront the Nazis and Hitler himself would be with reasoned argument. Well, you know, that's just not realistic, and one has to be realistic when bad things are in the offing. So I think Winston Churchill was right and Gandhi was wrong. But still, learning about what war is, learning about the horrors and pains of war is a good thing, so you know what you're getting into, and I think Lincoln Memorial is all about that, actually. It's also appropriate to learn about the pain one inflicts on others. So, for example, I don't like the objections to a critical exhibit about Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the Smithsonian that suggested that that was anti-patriotic and it should be taken down. I think actually it was to get people to think what they're doing to others, even in the name of an urgent cause, is a very important thing. It's all too easy to stigmatize foreign nationals as subhuman and justify any kind of treatment of them in that way. So any wise policy in the area of war and peace begins with an acknowledgement that war is bad and it's a last resort of a kind, and therefore we should always remember that it's inflicting pain not only on one's own people but on human beings on the other side. Finally, and I think this is really important, teach a love of historical truth and of the nation as it really is. One of the biggest problems of patriotism in this area is that the nation is often depicted in a completely unrealistic way, and often it goes with the stigmatization of some subgroup as the source of the real problems and so on. So one of the most important aspects of teaching patriotism in the schools is teaching people how to evaluate historical evidence, how to construct a historical narrative. And once people see that that's difficult and it is a construction, then they understand something. Patriots often dislike reality, and they prefer a glorified version of the past and present. And they fear that presenting the nation with all its warts is a way of undercutting love. And that was the source of the tremendous objection to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial when that design was first put forward and won the competition. People thought it didn't glorify America enough, and so they thought it was subversive. But in fact, over time, it's proven to be a tremendous source of common emotion and reconciliation, partly because, just by having that list of names, it presents the nation as it really is. And so I think one should not assume that the human heart can't stand reality, that lovers can't stand the real bodies of the ones they love. That is sometimes true in sad cases, but I think it's a very bad starting point for education. Well, obviously, patriotism in and of itself is not a good thing. And very often, it's a very bad thing. It can be taught very badly, and that teaching can do great damage. But what I've argued with Mazzini as my guide is that a nation that pursues goals that require common effort, sacrifice of individual self-interest, needs to be able to appeal to it in ways that draw not just on abstract principle, but on symbol, memory, and love of concrete places and people. If people interested in the relief of poverty, justice for minorities, democracy, global justice, say, oh, symbol is bad, rhetoric is bad, let's just have good arguments, I think that's just seeding the terrain of struggle to people who are against that. The emotions can be very dangerous, but they're also an essential part of human life and of human motivation toward action, good as well as bad, including prominently the struggle for justice. So I think the right thing to do is try to use history as our guide and try to imagine how those emotions can be the best that they can be. So now I'll stop and have your questions. Yes?
I'm a student from Austria, and I'm curious if your good form of patriotism is related to or needs a emancipatory past or movement to link to. You talked about Gandhi, you talked about King, you talked about Italy, you talked about France, but I just can't see how it could work for Austria, where we don't have any really time in the past where I could say I would be proud of that.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting. Yeah. Well, I think it is true that in the examples I've given, there is a sense, the sense of defining ourselves against an oppressor is useful. There's no doubt. But there are plenty of examples where that isn't necessary. I think Renan was thinking about France, which of course was more like Austria in the sense that there was no particular struggle, and the French Revolution, but that was ambiguous, obviously. And so the good values were realized through a very ambiguous and complicated struggle. I don't know. I think to give advice to another nation that you don't know well is a terrible thing to do. But what would an Austrian do? I think the thing would be to figure out what the task ahead is, what tasks involving the common good, justice for minorities, a decent economic policy, and so on, and then think what it is in the past that could stand for that. And of course, in both Germany and Austria, there are things that would want to be repudiated and criticized, and that's, of course, Lincoln is unequivocal that there are things in American history that must be criticized. But there are also things, there are traditions of thought. I guess I would say you could focus a great deal on traditions, intellectual, musical, artistic traditions that have been aspirational, that have been broader and more inclusive. And of course, in the case of Austria, you very much want to focus on features of landscape. All of this can be done very badly, as I think with Switzerland and the campaign against the minarets, the image of the Swiss landscape was used extremely badly as a kind of pure body that was going to be sullied and perhaps raped by the minarets, because they were presented as though they were standing slanting like missiles and they were looming over the countryside, but it was also a phallic symbol and they were about to rape Switzerland. So of course you don't want to use the purity of the landscape in that way, as though to suggest that it's sullied by some immigrant group. But there are ways of using landscape, as King does, that are inclusionary and that are that embrace all people, and I think that's what you would, that is what you would look for. And I think that, you know, Germany has managed to a great extent to do that. I guess what I worry most about when I'm in Germany and Austria is that there's still a tendency to define the identity of the nation not in narrative terms, but in ethno-linguistic terms. So, for example, I'm always asked, you have a Jewish name, but are you really Jewish? There's much too much emphasis on that question, as though it has something to do with where shall we really classify you in our mental landscape. And in Austria, I was even told once, oh, you're Jewish, but you look so Aryan. That was really creepy. But so you know, I think the task is to find a way of defining the nation that doesn't lean on ethno-linguistic homogeneity, and that is more difficult in Europe. I think that's one reason why Muslim immigration is such a terribly difficult struggle for the nations of Europe. So that I think what would need to be done, as with Lincoln and as with Gandhi and Nehru, is to find ways of representing the nation that don't lean on ethnicity and language. And of course, Gandhi was struggling to do that against a group who wanted to define India exclusively in Hindu terms. So it is a question of getting the right view. But beyond that, I think then which symbols to choose, that would have to be done by people who know. Yeah. Yes?
So to what extent can we achieve the benefits of patriotism by channeling self-interest through incentives? So for example, giving tax breaks to people who contribute to charitable institutions, or by paying people to join the military rather than counting on voluntary membership in the military?
I think a lot. That is to say, I think any program for a nation has to have an institutional side and a personal side. But it has to have both, because people are not going to vote to continue such programs unless they're made to care about it. And so if you think about Roosevelt, how did the New Deal come into being? It came into being because he didn't just have good ideas about programs, but he could sell them to the people using images, and he hired all these out-of-work artists and had them producing photographs that were highly motivational. I mean, I have a whole section in my book about that. And, you know, so people will not vote for the programs that might be good ones if they don't have these emotions there. And I think this struggle against racism in America is similar. Why will people support the Civil Rights Act if people don't present it to them in ways that actually move them? And in that case, it wasn't enough to move them. They had to, in many cases, overcome something in themselves, a kind of resistance or even disgust or whatever. And so you can't do that through good programs alone, but I think you have to present it to people in ways that grab hold of their emotions too. Yes?
Couldn't there be instances where bad values, coercive conscience, and uncritical homogeneity actually be beneficial in situations where the lack of this watery motivation is so damaging? I think of like Central Africa, where you'd have, you know, tribalism and barbarism and lots of other situations that have damaged the country in such a way that you may want to make these sacrifices in order to benefit the nation as a whole, in the sense that maybe even exclusionary values would be better than the values that are currently in place.
Well, I think when you're trying to establish the rule of law in the first place and you don't have it, then you probably need more solidarity and homogeneity than if you already have the rule of law, so that's true. But I think, you know, even then, you still want to introduce, I mean, I said begin with love, but you need to introduce the other very quickly. And nations in Africa that have done well, I think have usually done well through emphasizing principle as well as love. I had, as a child in school, I had to suddenly entertain an ambassador from Gabon, which had recently become independent, and because I played the piano, I had to play that national anthem. And I think that national anthem, which of course, I didn't learn it in 2 days, it sticks in my memory very much. And I think it's very interesting because it does emphasize principle, but it also has quite an attractive melody that popular singers like to sing. And so I think what the people in Gabon, which has done quite well, they managed to cultivate a kind of solidarity around this national anthem, which begins united in concord and fraternity, right? Unis dans la concorde et la fraternité. And yet, you know, at the same time, there's principle there, and it goes on and says, now we have to stand together because now we have a chance for happiness, and so I think you have to try to combine the two. And I mean, if you think of South Africa, where you have such a terrible legacy of awful division to overcome, of course, then you need images of solidarity, but it's better if they're images that encourage critical thinking about the past rather than muting it. I mean, think about Mandela and the rugby players, which now has, through the movies, you can always see the wonderful film Invictus, where apparently Morgan Freeman's portrayal of Mandela, I mean, Albie Sachs, the South African justice who knew Mandela personally, knows him very well, said that it's really uncanny how like Mandela he was. Well, the symbolism of the white rugby player and Mandela is a symbol of solidarity, but it's not a symbol of uncritical solidarity. It's a symbol that really makes you think, what was this division all about then? What were people thinking? And it's the kind of thing that in schools could easily generate, I think, a critical dialogue about the past and a much more analytical approach to the future, not just uncritical solidarity. Yeah.
Some of the things you've been focusing on specifically deal sort of with top-down realizations of patriotism, so such as the monuments or specifically schooling is something you focused a lot upon. And the fact that we can shift the way that we do schooling. We can start off with love, we can go through these different types of exercises to teach patriotism. But in a way, aren't we still dealing then just with coerced consciousness in general? I mean, are you to suggest then that without these types of top-down constructions of patriotism, we would be left without patriotism? Would we be left with only the bad form? Would we enter into those ethnocentric sort of ideas?
Well, I think there's always a difficult balance between teaching something and allowing critique of that. I remember once an article by Christina Hoff Sommers that said that feminism was a form of indoctrination, and I looked at her definition of indoctrination, and it actually fit basic medical instruction, where you don't get to put forward your Ayurvedic theory. It fit neoclassical economics, where you don't get to put forward your Marxian theory. And in fact, at one point, Harvard did have basic economics taught with dissident sections, where you would get the neoclassical in the lecture, and then you'd have your Marxian economics in the section. But they dropped it because I think they just thought it was too confusing. So it is true that if you're going to teach some basic thing, like the history of the US, you have to teach it one way. And I think you could say that that's coercive, but I think if you've thought about it and you think you can defend it, it's probably not so terrible, especially with young children. But then I think the way you avoid coerced conscience is you always allow a space for the one who wants to question it. If it's done in a civil way, if it's done in a way that's appropriate to the classroom, if it's done without intimidating and pillaring the other students, then I think that's fine. Now, of course, in maintaining that space, you also have to insist on certain things. You have to insist on civility. You have to insist on no demeaning stereotypes of disability, minority, and some people call that pejoratively political correctness, but I think it is just a way of creating a space in which discussion and a certain kind of dissent can actually occur. So I guess I would say that what the teacher should do is teach what seems to be right, and then of course as time goes on you would much more include the controversies and the differences and so on. But also never shut off debate, but try to lead people to understand what civil debate really is about. Yeah.
Professor Nussbaum, specifically American patriotism is called to attention. The previous administration of President George W. Bush, flag waving and propagating with us or against us slogan. The liberation of Dachau in April 1945 by General Patch's 7th Army never again was called for. No doubt, America goes to war. The Declaration of Independence in one hand, and weapon in the other. Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay.
Do you have a question?
Here it is.
Okay.
Where is American patriotism? Where was our outrage? And where was American justice?
Well, look, I think patriotism is something that does require thought. And in any administration, that administration will construct patriotism in its own way, and then others are certainly at liberty to say, there's been a mistake here, a profound mistake, and we want to suggest to you that you should do it this way. And you want to do that in a way that doesn't demonize, that doesn't exclude. I mean, Lincoln's second inaugural is the model you might look at, because of course he wants to say the South was wrong and what they did was evil. But he doesn't exactly say that. He's very careful. He says it may seem strange that a just God would, et cetera, ask people to get their bread through the sweat of other men's faces. And then he says, but judge not that ye be not judged. And then he rises to the height of malice toward none and charity toward all. So he lets everyone know what he thinks, and that he's convinced that he's right, that slavery was an evil institution, but he also refuses to demonize the South. He would rather point the way forward to a future in which we can all cooperate together to work for a common good. So I think that's the best way to construct patriotism in a time of deep political division.
We need to end on that. Thank you.
Okay.